The book of Ezekiel primarily contains a prophecy written after the first siege of Jerusalem in 597 BC concerning the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 587 BC, and its subsequent rebuilding, complete with specific instructions on how it is to be built and its order after the return from the exile. Interestingly, God never addresses Ezekiel by his name in this book. The only time he ever says it is when he is telling Ezekiel what to say to Judah in chapter 24. But when speaking to Ezekiel directly, he always addresses him as Son of Man. Now, when it comes down to the actual destruction in chapter 9, we see it is carried out by 6 men with weapons and a seventh with the writer's inkhorn in his hand to mark the foreheads of the righteous. And when it comes to the rebuilding of the temple in chapter 40, we see a man with a line of flax and a measuring reed in his hand, measuring the temple before it is shown to Ezekiel. However, this temple was never built. Now, one of the ways that Yeshua most frequently addresses himself in the Gospels is as the Son of Man, linking himself to the prophecies of both Ezekiel and Daniel. We see him fulfilling the first part of Ezekiel's prophecy in Revelation. But what of the second? In John chapter 2, Yeshua says to those making his Father's house a house of merchandise, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, John tells us that he was talking about his body, so this statement seems to exclude the physical temple from view. However, in Revelation 11, we see John measuring the temple, seemingly for its rebuilding before its destruction in 70 AD, just as the man of Ezekiel 40 did. In Hosea chapter 3, God says that the children of Israel will abide many days without a king, prince, or sacrifice, as well as things that relate to either true or false worship. Then afterward, they will repent and seek God and David their king. Now, this could have said they would abide forever without those things, but it doesn't, which implies that when David comes, those things that relate to true worship are reinstated, as the things of God were always on the forefront of David's mind. So to me, this confirms that John was indeed measuring the temple for its rebuilding. And I believe that will be the first undertaking after the regathering of Israel, when Yeshua comes to reign on the earth. Now, I am aware that Revelation 21 verse 22 says that there is no temple in New Jerusalem. And I will be giving my understanding of that at the end of this study. The reason that there is a need for a temple is because where God is present, perfection is required. But even after the kingdom comes, there will still be death and sin, as I show in my study of the millennial reign. Therefore, there must be atonement for that sin. Overall, though, the state of affairs in the land will be different than they were before, which is why we see changes to the order of the temple in Ezekiel's description. Jeremiah 31:34 says, "And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know Yahuwah. For they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith Yahuwah. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." And Zechariah 13:3 says, "And it shall come to pass that when any shall yet prophesy, then his father and his mother that begat him shall say unto him, Thou shalt not live, for thou speakest lies in the name of Yahuwah. And his father and his mother that begat him shall thrust him through when he prophesies." So these things show that Israel as a nation has matured. Thus we see changes in the sacrifices. In Ezekiel 46, we are given the details for the regular offerings, which are all burnt offerings unless otherwise stated. And I'm not completely sure about these, but I will state where I am with them right now. The daily offering, which was formerly a lamb in the morning and one in the evening, is now just a lamb in the morning. And I believe the original represented Israel and the Gentiles, but Israel has come. So now it represents the righteous Gentiles living outside the kingdom who are still immature. On the Sabbath, it is now 6 lambs and 1 ram, as opposed to 2 lambs. And I think this represents the Gentiles coming to the shepherd on day 7, perhaps with one maturing and leading others to him, just as Cornelius did in Acts 10. Isaiah 11 verse 10 says, "And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. Or the ram could be an Israelite leading them, like in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23, where it says that 10 men will grab hold to a Jew and go with him to Jerusalem. Then we have the new moon offerings, which is 1 bull, 1 ram, and 6 lambs, versus 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and a goat for a scent offering. And I believe this shows the priest accepting and teaching them. Isaiah 66 verse 23 says, "And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith Yahuwah." And I believe that this is the reason that the sin offering goes away, because the new moons are being observed without false leaders. Next, in Ezekiel 45, we have the feast day offerings. The first occurs on the first day of the first month, which is Rosh Hashanah. On this day, the sanctuary is cleansed by the blood of a bull on the temple doorposts, symbolizing the priest's obedience to God's command, while also commemorating God's passing over Israel's firstborn and signifying that those in the house belong to God. This feast seems to replace Yom Teruah, which is inaccurately called Rosh Hashanah and isn't explicitly mentioned in this book. Perhaps because it has already seen its fulfillment in the Lamb coming for his bride. Or maybe it will see its fulfillment in the future with the Lamb coming for his children before the temple is built. This same process is also repeated by the princes of Israel for the people on the 7th day of each month. And this appears to take the place of both Yom Kippur and the individual sin offerings. Next, we have the Passover, where a bull for a sin offering is prepared by the prince for himself and for the congregation. This takes the place of the Passover lamb. For the 7 days of unleavened bread, we have 7 bulls, 7 rams, and a goat for sin, versus 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 lambs, and a goat for sin. And we have the same for the Feast of Tabernacles. And this changes from a daily amount of bulls that begins at 13 on the first day, but then decreases daily until there is only 7 on the 7th day, along with 2 rams and 14 lambs. So I take this to mean that 7 of the lambs matured already because they represent Israel. So either the 7 bulls are the same as in the previous offering and now guide the other 7 lambs to maturity, or the matured rams now become bulls and guide the other 7 lambs to maturity. Considering that the 2 rams that were with the originals all along are not included, I am more inclined to the latter. The 8th day, or Atzarav, is missing, and I believe this is because sacrifices will cease on that day. The only other festival that is completely missing from the account is Shavuot, or Pentecost, and perhaps it is included in the collective term solemn assemblies. But I think it is more probable that its fulfillment is found in the outpouring of the Spirit in Acts, the harvest of the 144,000 in 70 AD, and the coming regathering. But in general, we can see that pretty much all of the feasts remain in the kingdom. The only feast that will require those Gentiles residing outside of the kingdom to come into it and pay their homage to God will be tabernacles. But it appears that they will also be keeping the new moons and Sabbaths outside, as we have already seen. Now, before all of this, in Ezekiel 43, you have the consecration of the altar. On the first day, a bull is offered for a scent offering. And this is opposed to a bull for scent offering and 2 rams, which was offered the first day of the consecration of Aaron's priesthood. Then on days 2 through 7, you have a goat for a scent offering, a bull, and a ram. And this is opposed to a bull for scent offering during Aaron's consecration. Now, the bull that is offered for sin for the priests and the congregation of Israel is burnt outside the sanctuary, but not outside the camp. And I believe this represents their being accepted and their sins forgiven. The bull and the ram that are offered on days 2 through 7 represent the covenants of salt with Aaron through Zadok, the bull, and David, the ram, being established, preserved, and continuing forever, which affects the preservation of the entire congregation. So the bull sin offering being replaced with a goat, I believe, foretells the slaughter of Gog's army at the last day. So that covers the sacrifice system. Now let's look at some of the other changes within the temple itself. First, there is no Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was a picture of God's throne, and the priests who bear it pictured the cherubim that were under it. Now, we are not explicitly told how many priests carried the Ark, but we are told it was carried by 2 poles that went through 4 rings on each corner. So logic would suggest that it was 4 of them, just like the cherubim. As for the throne itself, Jeremiah 3 tells us Jerusalem is the place of God's throne. And Ezekiel 43 verse 7 says more specifically that the place of Yah's throne is in the house where he will dwell in the midst of his people forever. There is also no table of shewbread. The table of shewbread with its 12 loaves, I believe, represents the 12 apostles, who were the ones that were with Yeshua for the Passover meal and who figuratively ate his flesh, representing his words and doctrine. And for their service, Yeshua promised them 12 thrones. And we don't see them in Ezekiel, but we do see them in Psalm 122. So we know they are nearby. There is also no menorah, which represents the saints of the 7 churches, as we see in Revelation. And Yeshua promised to make Philadelphia pillars in the temple of his God. So they will also be in the temple. Finally, we have the altar of incense, representing prayer, which of course remains, as evidenced by the incense being seasoned with salt. During the millennial reign, many will find themselves outside of the kingdom as Yeshua rebuilds the temple, as we saw in Zechariah 14. Now, Yeshua said the second temple was his Father's house. But in Acts 7, as Stephen quotes Isaiah 66, he tells us that the Most High does not dwell in houses made with human hands, which leads us back to Malachi 3, where we are told that it belongs to the messenger or angel of the covenant. And I expect the same for the coming temple. So I'm not convinced Yeshua will be serving in an earthly priestly capacity in this temple. I believe the prince, David, as firstborn of Yeshua, will serve as earthly priest and king, as demonstrated in his making the first sacrifice on the threshing floor of Ornan, where the temple was eventually built. So David will be king and priest of God, and Yeshua will be exalted to his appropriate position as King of Kings and priest of the Most High God, after the order of Melchizedek. So what will Yeshua be doing in the temple? In 1 Samuel 3, we saw that Samuel, which means name of God, was either in the holy place where the menorah was, or in the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant was, when God called to him while he was asleep. And Eli, which means ascent or highest, was also nearby. So although priests living in God's house was never sanctioned previously, it may not be unprecedented. Now in John 14, Yeshua told his apostles, in his Father's house there are many dwelling places. We already saw that the second temple was his Father's house. So it seems he was referring to the rooms for the priests here. In Psalm 15, David asks Yahuwah, who shall abide in your tabernacle? Who shall dwell in your holy hill? And in Psalm 65:4, he says, blessed is the man whom thou choosest, and causest to approach unto thee, that he may dwell in thy courts. We shall be satisfied with the goodness of thy house, even of thy holy temple. And again at the end of Psalm 23, he says, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of Yahuwah forever. So David also suggests that people will live in Yahuwah's house. Then in 1 Chronicles 17, when Yahuwah makes the covenant with David that he will build David's house, he also tells David that he will raise up his seed after him, which shall be of his sons, and establish his kingdom, and that seed will build him a house. And in verse 14, he says, I will settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forevermore. So given these scriptures, I am pretty well convinced that we will see the fulfillment of that in the millennial reign, when Yeshua will actually live in the temple, with the throne which he shares with his Father being in the Holy of Holies, as I also gather is the case now in the heavenly temple, based on Revelation chapters 4 through 7. If my understanding is correct, Yeshua will sit on that throne as his Father's earthly representative. And from there, he will continue to serve in his heavenly priestly capacity as high priest of God, revealing the true merging of heaven and earth. And the proof that God has sanctioned this is shown in the blood of the sin offering bull that the priest, not the prince, places over the temple door at least 12, but maybe 13 or 14 times a year. During the Exodus, the blood on the door declared that the firstborn of the house was God's firstborn, and the blood on the temple is doing the same. Now, believe me when I tell you, I understand how jolting this scenario is, even to me, and I know who Yeshua is. So imagine how sacrilegious it would seem to those who don't know him, particularly those outside the kingdom. This brings me to another possible reason for the final uprising. In my study of Revelation, I show that the judgments have already been fulfilled. However, futurists believe that it will be fulfilled when a coming Antichrist rises to power before Yeshua's so-called second coming. And I don't know that this belief completely dies even after he comes. I also don't believe the Bible will be going away anytime soon. Maybe Yeshua discards the test portion and perhaps the entire New Testament in the beginning of the millennial reign, turning to the Tanakh so that he can properly teach truth. But the test still has to come. And if this scenario plays out, when those writings are found, especially 2 Thessalonians 2, Yeshua will look like the man of sin and revived beast of Revelation. And futurism will be updated to account for it as those outside the kingdom wait for their Messiah to come destroy Yeshua, who they believe to be the Antichrist, giving way to Gog's rebellion. Just a little food for thought, but let me know what you think in the comments. Finally, let's deal with Revelation 21. Verse 22 says that there is no temple therein. The Greek word for this is neon, and it refers to the Holy of Holies and the holy place. The other word for temple is hieron, representing the entire temple. But John does state in verse 3 that the tabernacle of God is with men. And he says this also in John chapter 1, when the Word became flesh. It is noteworthy that this is after New Jerusalem fully descends on the 8th day, after the millennial reign and final judgment. So where I stand with this as of now is that during the millennial reign, there will be a physical temple, and the order of the temple will be very similar to previous orders. However, the people serving in that temple will be those redeemed in the first resurrection, who will come with Yeshua and reign with him. The rest will worship at that temple, and based on Isaiah 66, they may even serve in a priestly capacity, ministering to others. But all will learn righteousness from the actual priest, or not. The distinction will be made at the final judgment. Afterwards, all who remain will have been tried and proven faithful. So although I believe the physical temple will still be standing because Yeshua has to live somewhere, there will be no need for a holy place separating us from God. We will finally be like him and able to see him as he is. So we will all have direct access to him and his house.